to our lecture series. We are delighted to have you with us, and I've asked Nacho to present you so we can start. Welcome to WashU Online.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yes.
No, I'm so pleased to be here.
Wonderful. So Nacho, whenever you want.
So we're very pleased to present Professor Cortes Marez, who's a professor of ethnic studies from the University of California, San Diego, and the former president of the American Studies Association. He's someone that I'm very happy to invite him because I have read his work and find it very inspiring and provocative. He's the author of 3 books that I actually pulled out to revisit while he came to his visit. The first one is called Drug Wars, The Political Economy of Narcotics. And it's a really great book about the long durée history of the criminalization of drugs and the way in which it is tied to histories of empire and media. The second book, that is the one closer to the top, is Farm Worker Futurism, on speculative technologies of resistance and the representations of farm workers and ideas of futurity. And the last one, which is a really fascinating book, is University Babylon, which is at the intersection of university studies and ethnic studies, and shows the ways in which Hollywood and the university have worked together as institutions to advance narratives of race from eugenics to the present. So it's really, really great work. Today he's going to speak to us about his work on farm workers in the visual field. So Cortes, take it away.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Nacho, and it's really great to be here. So I'll go ahead and get started and share my screen. I don't know if people have seen this TikTok video going around of professors trying to share their screen. So I'm just newly self-conscious. Okay, so there it is. So thank you very much. The talk today is Farm Workers in the Visual Field, Racial Capitalism and Farm Worker Representation. Here's the cover of the book from which this talk is drawn. And the blurb, I'm really proud of the blurb. It's from a colleague of mine at UCSD, Ricardo Dominguez, who some of you may know. You should Google him after this presentation. He's both a performance artist and theorist, a kind of speculative theorist and performance artist himself. He's known, for example, for having been the Zapatistas webmaster. He helped them launch a denial of service attack on Mexican state internet servers on behalf of the Zapatistas. He's done sort of similar things against against the Pentagon, against different corporations. He's also known for the Transborder Immigrant Tool, which is this kind of performative art piece that is based in producing a cheap yet tricked out cell phone for border crossers. In and of his own right, he's really interesting, and he's done a lot of work on performance work around drones. And so I'll be talking a little bit about drones as well today. The cover is a still from, or is based on a still from Alex Rivera's 2008 film Sleep Dealer, which if people don't know, I would highly recommend. It's kind of amazing to me that it's 2008, but having watched it, it's really fresh and prescient. So the sort of premise of the film is that the US-Mexico border has been closed, and as a result, low-wage workers in Mexico come to the border, have themselves outfitted with computer nodes, and then they are hooked up to internet networks that enable them to work various kinds of work bots on the US side. So it's this kind of dystopic, utopic dream, all of the labor without the laborers. This was an early inspiring image for me, one of the earliest images from the film when he was producing the film, that is of these remote bots that are being operated by people on the other side of the border, and they're harvesting oranges. Let's see, so that, Rivera's film and his work, I hope to return to at the end of this talk if we have time, but is someone, his work is really cross-cut, as it were, throughout farm worker futurism. And so, I'll begin here by starting to give you, I'll just give you a little bit of text I'm going to read that will give you some of the conceptual framework and theoretical framework for the book and my remarks. And then I'll go through a keynote presentation that will be, more thematic and case study focused. So bear with me. I mean, one of the things that I think of methodologically for my project is, really taking up a kind of, almost classic or canonical cultural studies move. So of course, Raymond Williams is a cultural studies figure famous for keywords of vocabulary of culture and society, which of course has inspired a minor academic publishing industry now. There are a variety of these keyword collections that are sort of based on the Raymond Williams template. And one of the things that he sort of famously argued is that while over the course of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the word culture was increasingly defined as an abstract noun, as in phrases like high culture or culture, as he would say, using the kind of Oscar Wilde pronunciation or the Matthew Arnold pronunciation of culture. In its earlier uses, before that kind of use, culture was more often a noun of process, a noun that meant something like the tending of crops or animals. And so, in this talk, I attempt to, imaginatively turn back time, as it were, by reconnecting farm worker visual culture to the material processes of tending crops in corporate agriculture. So here you have a really wonderful painting by Daniel de Siga from 1976, the US bicentennial year, and I think that's kind of significant, called Campesino. And here you have the figure of the farm worker using a short-handled hoe, which, keep an eye on the short-handled hoe. It's going to come back in this presentation, but this is a kind of, I think, wonderful visual image that that kind of forces the eye, or not forces, but encourages the viewer to take this kind of circular view, that mimics both the hat and this circular view that, goes from the ground where the short-handled hoe is all the way around the back of the farm worker. So it kind of trains our gaze to think about the relationship between culture in terms of representation and culture in the sense of material processes of producing crops in the context of farm labor. So today, extrapolating from my book, I want to analyze struggles in the visual fields between California agribusiness and farm workers of color. Agribusiness corporations have historically used cameras to surveil and control farm workers, while farm worker unions have employed cameras to imagine better worlds and project different, more egalitarian future social orders. Understood in this way, the idea of the visual field or visual fields of agricultural production in California is an important site where farm workers oppose forms of racial capitalism. I draw on Cedric Robinson's theorization of racial capitalism, a concept he famously introduced in his book, Black Marxism, but a subsequent elaboration of the theory of racial capitalism, which is much less well known, I think, is in a book called Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, Blacks and the Regimes of Race in American Theater and Film Before World War II. And that's a book that suggests or elaborates the concept of racial capitalism as a lens for thinking about visual culture. There Robinson argues that racist film representations have rationalized the exploitation of workers of color and included or encouraged racism among white workers. Films vilifying people of color, he concludes, have historically normalized the disciplining of Black and Latinx labor and encouraged white racism to the benefit of finance capitalists, many of whom were themselves also invested directly in film industries in the early 20th century. So while Robinson focuses on commercial films, I've really found his ideas inspiring and useful for other contexts. So I'm using them to analyze agribusiness and especially union-made visual culture, including photography, film, painting, posters, theater, and spectacular protests. In the spirit of Robinson, I'm analyzing all of these forms of visual culture as weapons in battles between corporate growers and farm workers and farm worker unions. To turn to the phrase visual fields, I use the term visual fields to describe how diverse, often competing visual perspectives are structured by intersecting hierarchies of race, gender, and other axes of difference. In neuroscientific theory, the term visual field refers to the spatial array of visual sensations available to introspective observation. In this sense, the visual field is composed in response to external visual stimuli, but is not its direct reflection. And dramatic differences can occur between the exact form of sensory stimulation and the final sensory experience. When a subject's sight is in part physically blocked, for example, perception will often fill in the blank, as it were, imaginatively providing versions of what is visually missing, suggesting that the visual field presupposes subjective cognitive mapping. It's not just reflecting reality, it's producing reality out of this matrix of differences. I draw on this model from neuroscience to pluralize it in order to theorize the heterogeneity of visual fields in particular times and places, arguing that visual fields are partially constituted by forms of socially and historically produced perceptual mapping that in turn shapes the construction of historical social realities. Simply put, there are multiple, often warring ways of seeing the world. And in the present context, this means that we can partly understand conflicts between agribusiness and farm worker unions as struggles between antagonistic visual fields. I thus study the dialectic between agribusiness and farm worker visions of the future. Agribusiness films and other visual propaganda project a future of high-tech automation and a world free from farm worker demands, whereas farm workers imagine futures of freedom, abundance, and the equal distribution of life chances. In operation to forms of agribusiness sovereignty, partly secured by domination of visual fields, farm workers have claimed what Nicholas Mirzoff calls the right to look. Thus, studying their visual culture enables the reconstruction of subaltern counter histories of visuality. So, I'll move away from just reading text now for a while and present some images and case studies. And just with a proviso at the beginning, I'm trying to give you a really broad overview of the project. And so one of the things that might mean is that some of the historical specificity as I move across decades will be less apparent, will be blurred, but I'm happy to do some of that more historicist work in question and answer. I'd like to think of there's both a kind of nonlinear digital companion to this book project called Cesar Chavez's video collection, which has a set of what within the digital platform are called paths that you can take through the project in any order. And given the content of the project, I'd like to think of them as rows or like crop rows. And so I'm going to try and appropriate or approximate some of that feeling here by going through what I'm thinking of the central themes or the central crop rows of this project. So agribusiness futurism versus farm worker futurism, part of that dialectic of imagining different futures via visual technologies, business relations or agribusiness relations of looking and farm worker responses, reversing the gaze, and finally, aerial perspectives. So in terms of the first row, the project is framed in terms of different visions of the future based in agribusiness visual culture versus farm worker union visual culture. And on the agribusiness side, it's quite clear that the dream, at least from the Cold War, up to the present, the dream has really been for agribusiness to use technology in a way that disciplined workers. And in a lot of ways, the fantasy is about imagining a future of automation in which workers and worker demands no longer exist. But in practice, it never actually works out that way. So historically, in California agriculture at least, automation has never absolutely eliminated workers from the agricultural field. Actually quite the contrary. Various forms of automation have enabled the ramping up of production in ways that have actually expanded the need for the exploitation of human labor, farm worker labor. But the farm worker visions or the agribusiness visions of the future are all about more profits and less labor conflict through technology. And so on the top right, you see, this is from the 40s, one of the initial mechanistic dreams was the mechanical cotton picker that would replace Black and brown and Asian laborers in California and large parts of the South and Southwest. And in many ways, I argue that this kind of machine overlaps with Cold War era robots, at least in the way in which they look in science fiction. At the bottom, there is an image from a 70s. I think this was a book produced for Epcot, the Epcot Center as part of Disney World in Florida. They wanted a sort of futuristic an exhibit about the future of agriculture from agribusiness. And so all of these agribusiness interests produce these kind of futuristic images of the automated farm future. And here's a rendition of a satellite-driven tractor. And then on the left, you have International Harvester's Tracto, the talking robot, which was a robot built out of course, tractor parts, and would be at various world fairs and exhibits. And this fantasy is quite durable, this idea of this kind of robot. And in particular, the sort of prop of the white child is really kind of strange here. So that, I think, Tracto is from the 60s, but these kinds of images and dreams go back, much earlier. So in the 30s, I talk about a variety of ways in which there's a kind of dream of a future, automated world in the fields. And so this is from a state fair in Iowa in 1938. And before there was Tracto, the talking robot, there was Harvey Harvester from the International Harvester Company. It's the same company. They make tractors. And this one was also talking. It would speak and it would be voiced remotely from someone sitting in some room and broadcasting out of it. And it's just striking to me that it's the replacement, it's the better version of the Mexican farm worker you see. It's got a kind of metallic sombrero on. And what's also finally notable is the in contrast with the actual historical moment in which Mexican farm workers and Filipino farm workers were being framed as part of a moral panic who potentially sexually threatened white families and white women. It's notable that the robotic dream of the farm worker made the farm worker safe as a figure around white girls and young white women. And here you see that as if signifying the newly disciplined ersatz, mechanical Mexican farm worker, you see a kind of little chain link fence around his waist, as if to suggest that kind of a new safety. By contrast, farm workers had their own projections of the future, and projections that jog along with the history that I'm talking about. So there are certainly examples, in the 40s and 50s, a Cold War period, of a kind of global imaginary where farm workers were imagining that the world would belong to them, to the disinherited belong the earth. And that was imagined, visually from a perspective in space, where farm worker flags and emblems would show the planet as if from some outer space perspective. This instead is an image from a member of an important arts collective that was former farm workers who were allied with the United Farm Workers movement. And so this particular artwork is Ricardo Favela's piece, UFW Cooperative Space Station Numero Uno. And so, you have that kind of, view of the crops, very futuristic, technological looking image. This imagery actually looks very much like period phantasmatic representations or fantastic representations of what space colonies could really look like. But here, the future of the high-tech world is one that is supporting farm worker collectivity. It's a cooperative as opposed to capitalist exploitation. And this the whole idea of the United or the Royal Chicano Air Force is kind of a speculative joke, right? Like, what if poor working class brown people had an air force? And so this artistic collective really played out the implications of that kind of joke. And so they have a Nuevas de Aztlán automotive collective that they built. Again, it's collective. It's surrounded by this kind of sci-fi murals and imagery. And in the foreground, you can see these kinds of these pylons that are in the air, very space age looking. So this was a kind of mid-60s, late 60s kind of style that was meant to look jet age. And so they sort of incorporated that into this future-oriented collective garage. And here another Royal Chicano Air Force artist, Esteban Villa, third world astro pilot of Aztlán. So, it almost seems to me, I don't know if people remember any of this, there was this whole 70s moment of thinking about ancient astronauts, how perhaps aliens visited the U.S. planet, or visited the planet in ancient times, and that sort of explained various kinds of both Egyptian, archaeological remains and Mesoamerican archaeological remains. And it almost seems as though Villa is riffing off of that by imagining the third world astro pilot of Aztlán. She's a woman, which is sort of notable in the moment. And then again, the sort of third world astro pilot, it suggests a kind of global or globalist perspective, thinking about the difference between the global South and the first world, and imagining the farm worker struggle as a third world struggle. Row 2. Second theme in the book has to do with agribusiness relations of looking and labor control. So, here to the right is an illustration from a kind of Fortune magazine puff piece that was promoting one of the biggest agribusiness corporate heads in the southern San Joaquin Valley of California in the 40s and 50s. Still, his corporation, the Georgia Corporation, is still major owner of agricultural land and production throughout the world, actually. Lots of Latin American holdings as well. And what's notable to me is the way in which this image insists upon the powerful gaze of the agribusiness corporate head. The fact that he's holding sunglasses in his hand draws our attention to the fact that that he has a powerful gaze, perhaps too powerful for us to stare into without the sunglasses. And the sort of power of that gaze as he's looking directly at the viewer is reinforced by the kind of phallic imagery of the rest of the image. So the phallic arm, the phallic tie, the phallic pens on the desk, even the corporate head seems phallic, and he's backgrounded by all of the signs of corporate infrastructural power. So you see the rows of agricultural land. Behind him on the right is a crane and a railroad that he has helped build up and commandeer. And then to the left, you see this conveyor belt moving produce up. And one of the things that's striking to me is you'll see a row of about 3 or 4 farm workers wearing these big straw hats with their heads down. So this seems to me in some ways like a symbolic representation of the actual relations of looking that informed the exploitation of agricultural labor. So here it's represented in symbolic ways, in a way that redound to the power of the corporate agribusiness head, and suggests that the appropriate thing for farm workers to do is to avert their gaze. That what it means to be a farm worker is really to be visually in a subordinate position relative to the powerful gaze of the boss. And so, all of those relations of looking and not looking are relationships that are, of course, cross-cut with ideas about race, with ideas about gender and gender difference, right? To have a gaze is to have masculine power. To not have a gaze, to be the object of a gaze, is to be racialized, feminized, etc. And this has a real material life, direct material life in agricultural fields. So at the very beginning, when I was talking about Raymond Williams and was showing you that image of the farm worker with a rounded back using the short-handled hoe, well, the short-handled hoe is an important prop in the agribusiness relations of looking, or even a tool or weapon in agribusiness visual culture. So the short-handled hoe, even though it has kept coming back, was made illegal in the 1970s, and one of the reasons why it was made illegal is because it was viewed, ultimately, and some of the same case law governs cases over keyboards, the way in which our computer keyboards can injure us. An important kind of precedent-setting cases were around farm workers and the use of the short-handled hoe, because the short-handled hoe requires you to bend over the whole time that you are working, and it produced debilitating, career-ending injuries for farm workers. And part of the legal problem was really to demonstrate that farm workers were human, that farm workers weren't just an extension of the prostheses of agribusiness production. So a lot of the case law was about demonstrating that against agribusiness claims that farm workers were naturally predisposed to this kind of work, to stoop labor. Part of what was necessary to ban the short-handled hoe was to prove that that farm workers were people, were humans, not machines. And one of the things that was useful about the short-handled hoe, well, there are two things that were useful about the short-handled hoe for agribusiness. One, the short-handled hoe was a means of worker control and surveillance. So at a glance, a manager, when looking at the gridded rows of crops, could see who was working and who was resting. Whereas if you have a regular long hoe, you could be standing up and working, or you could just be messing around. You could be resting. Whereas the idea was, at least if you had to bend over, you had a good guess. No one would bend over. It was so painful. No one would bend over like that to rest. right? So if you were bending over using the short-handled hoe, that meant you were working, and you could just sort of see that in the visual field of these rows of crops. But secondarily, it had the added benefit of reinforcing symbolically and gesturally farm worker subordination, because it required farm workers to assume physical positions that have historically been coded as racially subservient, as gender subservient, as feminized, primitive, et cetera, and again, averting the gaze. So the image on the right is the kind of exception that proves the rule. This is a farm worker using a short-handled hoe who strains to look up and look at the photographer, Leonard Nadel, who took these kinds of famous images. And so that's clearly, you have to contort your body to be able to meet the gaze of the camera. By contrast, farm worker unions were very invested in trying to reverse the gaze, wanting to produce their own imagery and films, and actually wanted to take the leaders of agribusiness and the police that supported their interests and put them on camera. So these are images from a very famous UFW documentary, Fighting for Our Lives. At the top left is this owner of a big farm who is kind of provoked by farm workers into just acting like a fool and goofing around them. And behind him, you see a man with a camera bag. So that's the camera person who constantly follows him around and takes pictures. And so they were sort of reversing the gaze there. Of course, on the bottom left, you see Kern County police officers. They were constantly photographing and videoing or filming farm worker protests. And then on the right, this is another agribusiness corporate head. And it's just kind of amazing in the film. Not only does he carry his own cameras, but he's so deranged by the fact that he's being filmed that with those big oversized glasses, he literally keeps bumping his head up against the UFW camera as if to assert his superior vision, his superior gaze. And so one of the things that really emerges from this is the way in which the farm worker elite and the police are used to thinking that their view of the world matters and that the view of farm workers doesn't matter. And so when the tables are turned, when the cameras are turned, it's deranging. It seems to disrupt their whole bodily schema. So here's some footage from Fighting for Our Lives. One of the things that the pandemic has revealed is how poor our infrastructure is for sharing streaming video in real time. So I'm despairing. I don't know if this is going to work, but we'll see if you all can see at least some of this. So this is footage I've kind of re-edited to draw attention to all of the efforts by farm workers elites to evade the camera, to hide their faces. In some cases, they put hands up over the camera. In other cases, they dance away from the camera. There's that fellow bumping his head up against the camera. Ultimately, this footage ends up with the police looking nervous under the gaze. So that police officer spraying pepper spray, if you can see him, keeps looking nervously here. This officer looks nervous under the camera. Ultimately, there's footage of a local police officer or sheriff who his whole, in Fanon's language, his whole bodily schema seems to be disrupted by existing under the gaze. It's as though there's a hole being burnt in his head. He's kind of scratching his head as the camera is on, and clearly very uncomfortable in his uniform and skin. Again, to keep thinking about reversing the gaze, it's not well known, but Cesar Chavez was really quite a film buff. He was an amateur photographer. He loved his Olympia Nikon cameras, usually donated by friends and allies of United Farm Workers. He was also an early adopter of home video. So there's just hours and hours and hours of Chavez filming like family birthdays and also political events on home video. Of course, very invested in UFW filmmaking, and really had a strong idea about how to frame various issues. He is probably the most photographed Chicano in world history. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that one index of farm worker subordination is that while they're often the objects of a photographic gaze, they've rarely been their subjects. Chavez is an important exception, was always thinking about how UFW protests would look on camera. And in particular, in ways when I get to the aerial gaze, I can say more about, he was very interested in how the UFW could produce visual spectacles like marches that would look good from aerial cameras and that would in effect commandeer the attention of the news media to look from above on farm worker struggles. So here he is from fighting for our lives, and you can see he's got a camera around his neck. And one of the reasons for the camera was it was really defensive. It was also defensive. To have a camera on the lines, was it a way to discourage the police or different kinds of vigilante thugs from engaging in violence? So it was a kind of visual shield. Let's see, I think I've already talked about the short-handled hoe, so I'll skip that just to note that the image up there is Chavez's short-handled hoe, which is now a part of the Smithsonian Institute. And on the Smithsonian website, you can actually see it reproduced in a little QuickTime movie. So they kind of animate his hoe. So yeah, I think, reversing the gaze, Esther Hernandez, so she's an important artist and ally of United Farm Workers. And here you can see, contra, oh wait, let's see, am I out of order here? I'm a little out of order here, sorry. Okay. Okay. Okay, sorry. Let's stay with reversing the gaze and Esther Hernandez. So this image here is from the digital companion Cesar Chavez's video collection to this discussion, and I really think of Esther Hernandez as really helping to do a kind of reversal of the gaze. So this is one of her most famous works that some of you may have seen, the Sun Mad, which is a protest against pesticide use in the field as part of the UFW campaign. This is from 1982. And of course, it's a riff on the Sun-Made raisins label. So just a little bit of prose to talk about how Hernandez reverses the gaze here. One striking aspect of the Sun-Made trademark is the way it appropriates women's labor and converts it into an advertisement. Part of the reason Peterson is the last name of the woman who is the model for the Sun-Made label logo. She was picked to represent the company's product because she actually worked in a packing shed. She was featured with the costume and tools of her job, including a bonnet for protection from the sun and the wooden platter used to hold grapes. Large numbers of women worked for agribusiness companies. And by the 1930s, many of them were Mexicans who engaged in union organizing and strikes. But as transmuted by corporate commodity aesthetics, the image of the raisin worker became an ad for white nativism. Recalling the conventions of backlighting in Western art analyzed by Richard Dyer, the bright yellow sun that imaginatively lights the sun-maid from behind serves to foreground her whiteness. Even the grapes she holds are Thompson or white grapes. The trademark, moreover, represents the figure of the female worker within the naturalizing framework of the patriarchal farm. Although in 1915, Peterson, again the model for the original ad, was an adult woman of marriageable age, in the label, she becomes a maid, an unmarried girl, presumably still living at home and contributing her labor to her family. The phrase sun maid further naturalizes and idealizes the process of corporate agriculture, suggesting that it's the heat of the sun and not low-wage workers that make raisins. As Hernandez explained, she began thinking about SunMad when she learned about dangerous levels of pesticides in the water tables of her hometown. On stationery emblazoned city of Danuba, Raisinland, USA, the director of public works informed Hernandez's mother that 4 of the city's 8 wells were contaminated with a pesticide used in agriculture. As she explained, SunMad has to do with going home to visit my mother in 1979. My mother saved articles out of the newspaper and notices from the mail that talked about the water contamination, especially in our barrio. For 2 years, I thought about it. Then my mind went back to the work I did when I was a farm worker and to the work that was still going on in that immediate area, growing grapes for the raisin industry. I focused on something personal, the sun-made box. Slowly, I began to visualize how to transform the sun-made and unmask the truth behind the wholesome figures of agribusiness. End quote. The sun-made label is personal for Hernandez because it pretends to represent the kinds of farm labor that she and her community had actually performed and continue to perform. In my reading, SunMad also satirized the devil's bargain between patriarchal white nativism and corporate conservatism. Hence, her revision of the corporate logo, Hernandez defetishizes agribusiness representation by connecting them to material labor conditions. In Marx's famous account, commodity fetishism refers to the ways in which the symbolic attractions of commodities take on an imaginary life of their own that partly displaces from public view and reflection the human labor that produced them. By contrast, in examples like the sun-made raisin trademark, the label of making raisins is not hidden. Rather, the representation of labor itself becomes a fetish, constructed from the image repertoire of white nativism and abstracted from the actual labor conditions of corporate agriculture. SunMad undermines that fetish by making visible the human costs of agricultural production. Hernandez thus employs a rigorously de-reifying gaze, revealing the racialized and gendered forms of exploitation obscured in corporate advertising. By basing her image on the sun-made label, Hernandez is able to take advantage of its high visibility and by extension, the corporation's vast publicity machine to further the visibility of her critical image. Hernandez's use of visual technology is formally complex and experimental in ways that contradict dominant assumptions about those aesthetic qualities, in part because she participates in a larger field of politically engaged farm worker visual culture. She made SunMad started as a silkscreen print, and a large number of prints have been made, often finding their way into UFW marches and other protests. SunMad has been extensively reproduced on postcards and t-shirts that have been incorporated into protests as well as the marches and ceremonies memorializing Cesar Chavez after his death. But such reproductions have also served to disseminate the image in everyday contexts and spaces. In this way, SunMad infects SunMade, so that once you've seen Hernandez's image, it is impossible not to think of, so that once you have seen Hernandez's image, it's impossible not to think of it whenever you see an ad for raisins. And I was reminded of that earlier today when I was getting ready for this. If you just do a search for SunMad raisins, and Google will give you a variety of sub searches. One of them that comes up is Esther Hernandez. So it's become sort of unavoidable that SunMad has infiltrated SunMade. I think I'm going on quite a bit. I'm going to just run through slides very quickly and open it up for conversation. The fourth row is really about how agribusiness employs a top-down aerial view. And this is really a convention of lots of agribusiness, advertising, photography, filmmaking, as if to suggest, again, this kind of hierarchy of vision, a kind of hierarchy of vision that in many ways, overlaps with conventions, settler colonial conventions in Hollywood. These kinds of over-the-top, aerial views are still very much a part of agribusiness hegemony in California. And they've been aided and abetted by the availability of drones. So this is a still from a corporate promotional film that was made. There's this organization in California, a corporation that specializes just in drone videos for agribusiness. And this is a photo or a poster, again, by Esther Hernandez, where she's reappropriating an aerial photography to protest pesticides. We could think again about the Royal Chicano Air Force and their sort of commandeering, imaginative commandeering of the crop duster for liberatory purposes. And I'm running way out of time, but I was planning on thinking about how these things kind of cash out in Al Trivetta and Cristina Ibarra's recent film, The Infiltrators, about undocumented immigrant activists trying to enter ICE facilities. It really draws attention in so many ways to the politics of visibility in a way that I don't have time to really explain here. But they end up using drones in really interesting ways. So one of the visual problems of The Infiltrators is they're telling a story about people who've infiltrated ICE detention facilities, but of course they can't bring their cameras there. And so, there's these kind of amazing, beautiful, haunting images of the Broward County Detention Center that are aerial, that are drone images. So again, it seems to me like that reversing the gaze, that recommandeering of an aerial perspective, so that this recent film by Alex and Christina is really kind of in the legacy of these longer histories involving farm workers in the visual field. So yeah, I'll just stop there, and hopefully we have time for some discussion.
Okay, wonderful. Curtis, you have a fascinating material here. I'm sure that there are many questions. I was happy to see that there were people who have worked with images regarding the Bracero program, photographs and all that connects to the visual production of certain ideology regarding Mexican workers. So I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. So please, anybody, Nacho, you can direct the question to Curtis.
Yes, so you can raise your hand in the Zoom. You can also put a question in the chat. And I have Diana Montaño, our colleague Diana Montaño, asking the first question.
Hi, thank you very much. Looking forward to reading more about this, but I do have a question about whether or not this can also be a transnational, there can be a transnational story behind this, on how Mexican labor was imagined and entered the visual field of Americans before the time period that you study in the book. So going back to the Porfiriato and how Mexican labor was ways in which Americans were incentivized to invest in Mexico. So this imagining of brown bodies has a longer history. So I'm just wondering about that, about the timeline. And then the other thing is whether or not this is a very California-centric imagining of Mexican labor. Whether if we go to Texas, there will be a different visual culture, or going to Oregon or Washington. So those two questions to begin. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Yes, truth in advertising, the focus is really on California, and even particular agricultural valleys there. So you're right. I mean, and a lot of the photos that I'm showing. So for example, yes, the photos by Leonard Nadel were of the Bracero program, and the whole series of photographs. They begin with induction centers in the interior of Mexico and move up to large parts of the United States. So to be sure, I haven't exactly done. I thought a little bit about that because the UFW was so active in Arizona for a while. So I thought a little bit about that. But you're right; it is very much California focused. And I guess one of the things that I would say about that is in part that I think, let's see, what could you say? So California looms large, especially in my second book. That's a book about Hollywood and universities. But there's part of what I'm trying to do, or part of what I do, I think, in farm worker futurism is kind of displace Los Angeles as the center of cinematic and visual culture. And so part of what's interesting about the California context is that it's in this kind of tense dialogue with the hegemonic kind of image making production in Southern California and Los Angeles. So I have a former graduate student who did a dissertation about cinematic culture in Fresno, California, and as if riffing on Walter Benjamin's Paris, capital of the 19th century, called the chapter Fresno, capital of the 20th century. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. Let's see, the other question you raised, absolutely. So again, this book is largely a kind of a post-war book. In some of my earlier work, I think about issues of Mexican immigrants and Mexican labor in film and photography. Not so much in this book. But one of the things that's really interesting is you do get in a lot of silent films, at any rate, you get these representations of, of course, we all know about representations, I think, of, Mexican bandidos, which are, effectively criminalizing the Mexican Revolution and criminalizing Mexican workers. But there's a lot of, early silent cinema where the labor context is less agricultural and more extractive. It's about mining, miners and mining. So you have, silent films that are about those kinds of extractive industries where Mexican miners are communists, anarchists, troublemakers of a variety of sort, at least, in U.S. silent, in U.S. silent cinema. And all mixed up with Chinese workers. So the other in early cinema, if you were to kind of do a survey of racial capitalist labor formations, in addition to Black labor, it would really be Chinese labor and the kind of close association between Mexican immigrants and Chinese immigrants. So I don't know if that's exactly gotten to your question. I'm not sure if you meant that, if that's also what you meant by transnational. In other words, there's also, so much early, like Mexican cinema that are actualities, which are the equivalent of quasi documentaries. That would be ripe for more of that kind of transnational analysis that is limited in my book, admittedly.
Deborah, please.
Hi. So I have some comments. I'm sure there's a question in there somewhere. But I mean, I was fascinated in part because I know about the DeGiorgio strike, and I work on farm workers, especially during the before the period you really concentrate on. But you talked about the DeGiorgio strike, and then you situated the UFW, the picture that the picture of this, of a farm worker future that is free from sort of what was I going to say, from the oversight of big agriculture. But it's fascinating that in that picture there are no workers in the scene. And I wonder what that says about imagining a future where there are no workers, and that, and then how, I'm sure you know Mitchell's book, Lie of the Land, which was his first book. And for those of you who don't know the book, it's a great book, and it talks about the production of California as a place that was made in certain ways from nature, as opposed to from the labor of farm workers and other workers. So I wonder how this book might, or your work in general, might speak to that idea as well. And then the last thing, it's just a question. So I know you know, I'm sure you know the film that was produced out of this, what was I say, the DiGiorgio strike and the aftermath. And I was sort of, that was a very different, I mean, so it was a short film produced by Ernesto Galarza was one of the people on the film, and it was about the strike and the kinds of conditions and what the union that he was trying to mobilize was fighting for. So so my question is, why didn't you include that as a direct a way of refuting the kinds of airbrushed vision of labor that the DiGiorgio, corporation put out?
Sure. No, thank you. Thank you for those questions. Let me just ask, like the one about the image. I think you were asking, was it? I think it was this image, the futurist image that you were referencing. So yeah, I guess I would slightly disagree. These two folks in the foreground, they're campesinos. One is wearing a straw hat with the UFW flag on the top. There are two people here, and you can see people here. So, I see what you're saying, that it does have that kind of long angle shot of the fields, but it's not absent of human figures. And in fact, if you looked at period images of space colonies, they've actually included figures in a way that is unusual generically, or at least the artist did. And you're absolutely right. The DiGiorgio strike is, in my view, hugely important. And that film, I think it's called Poverty in the Valley of Plenty, that they made is really hugely important. So, that doesn't come through in this chapter or in this talk, but the chapter one, the first chapter is about that strike. The first chapter of the book is about that strike, and it cashes out in terms of the film. It kind of begins with, thinking about that particular strike against the DiGiorgio Corporation as partly utopian. Like I have an image in the book that shows their flag, which says, "To the disinherited belongs the earth," and it shows the planet Earth as though it has this, as I was suggesting in the talk, when I was suggesting there was a kind of farm worker planetary imaginary. That was one thing I was, thinking about. And then what happened with the film that they made is complicated. It's quite complicated. But you're right. It's absolutely, and it's this kind of thing that it's this kind of strike that is, in part because it had this cinematic context, is fascinating to me. A lot, a number of people have, as you know, have analyzed it, but it's kind of been minorized, I guess, a little bit in the history of labor struggles. And again, one thing that's notable, one of the leaders of that strike, Ernesto Galarza, was kind of like Chavez, a kind of photo and film buff. And so part of what I talk about in this chapter is, in a kind of speculative futurist way, the way in which Galarza effectively does something like Eisensteinian montage with farm worker photos in a way that is temporally disrupting and formally disruptive, and what have you. And so, flash forward a little bit later, some of the images I was showing of the short-handled hoe were done by Leonard Nadel, and it was supposed to be a companion piece to Ernesto Galarza's book, Merchants of Labor, about the Bracero program. So so Galarza is a kind of major figure, and that strike is a major figure in the book.
Cristina, go ahead.
Hi. I was, so with fair warning, this may be a little bit out of the context of or beyond the scope of your work, but I was definitely thinking about the concepts you talked about in terms of reversing the gaze, with the strategies of how workers were able to mobilize cameras and things like that to their advantage, applied to much more of the 21st century context, and just sort of thinking about how the surveillance state has become so insanely more massive since the 1970s and things like that. And I know you mentioned activist drones and things like that. And obviously we know with Black Lives Matter and the Ferguson uprising, how important cell phone footage has been to this sort of democratizing process of who gets to look and things like that. But I also, facial identification technology is something that's been so increasingly weaponized by the state. And I guess I was just sort of wondering if you could speak more to the state of where we are now, and whether sort of this gap between who controls this technology can really be closed, in your opinion.
It's a big, those are big questions. Thank you for that. I was, some of those questions are addressed by the film I was talking about at the end, The Infiltrators. The film came out after she wrote her book, but I've really found Rebecca Schreiber's book, The Undocumented Everyday is the name of the book. She's looking at the use of film, photography, and video by immigrant rights groups. And there are really interesting differences between, say, immigrant rights groups versus groups like that are actually led by undocumented immigrants. And so, one of the concepts that she comes up with, or one of her concepts, is she has all these sort of like ideas about how undocumented immigrants are engaging in forms of counter visibility that is countering the kind of effort to make them visible by ICE. And these are all kind of our overlapping categories. Counter documentation, using media to produce, documentation of how people are treated in ICE facilities. And then the other concept is counter surveillance. So, precisely in contexts where you have, older forms of surveillance, just, old-fashioned photography with things like biometrics and face recognition and motion detection sensors. And then just more broadly, ideologically, she talks about racial profiling as its own kind of surveillance technology. That in those kinds of contexts, undocumented immigrants have, engaged in their own kind of counter surveillance. So much of what that film, The Infiltrators, is about is how these, and it's funny, it's this performative thing, is what happens is these undocumented youth, they want to get into detention centers, but you can't just go to a detention center and say, put me in a detention center. So number one, so in fact, they fail the first time because there's a performative element. One of these young activists goes and she doesn't fit the part enough. She doesn't have the right costume. The hair doesn't look right. The English is too good. And so they go back and revisualize, reimagine how you're going to perform so you get in. But then at the same time, what they do, these activists, is they use their cell phones to record and film. And so The Infiltrators both sort of dramatizes that and incorporates actual you know, that actual footage, you know, recording of them being inducted into the detention center and then trying to help get, you know, get people out. So again, I don't know if that, you know, if that ever closes the gap, but it's really, really complicated thing where Rebecca Schreiber talks about how, you know, contra-liberal ideas about visibility, you know, and representation, being visible is dangerous if you're undocumented or different kinds of subjects, right? So the idea within a kind of liberal aesthetics is visibility is about liberation, but in fact, visibility can be about being deported. And so the film is dealing with exactly those kinds of contradictions because they were trying very hard for a kind of radical visibility, right? We're not in the shadows, we're not going to hide, we're the undocumented. They did that. One of the central figures in the film, when the film came out, was deported, in part because of his newfound visibility in relationship to this film. So yeah, these are really complicated issues. And one of the things that I kind of argue is that, you know, so you were saying, you know, rightly that things have changed in terms of surveillance between, say, the 70s and the contemporary moment. But, you know, I think our contemporary moment is really building upon the historical sedimentation of the past. So people used to talk about, you know, if you're thinking about the history of this kind of surveillance, people used to talk in the 80s about the gang database produced by LAPD in California, which was a little bit more old-fashioned. It was less digitized, but you pull someone over, you take their picture, you take all the information, you add it to a computer database. You know, before that, agribusiness starting in the 30s and 40s had a huge database on troublemaking farm workers. That came out of partly photographic surveillance, but also, you know, police surveillance, and they were narrative reports. So, you know, I just think that there's this kind of longer history of that kind of surveillance that has a new technological interface, but that prior history is still important.
Doris?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for this talk. This was just fantastic. And I really want to immediately get your book and go read it. But I couldn't help but thinking about, I was thinking about the history of artists during the New Deal, and I'm blanking on the name of the exact program, but the artists that were funded by the New Deal to, you know, and there was a series of like depictions all across the nation and many of those were depicting farm work or pastoral scenes, and how that visual representation is also drawing on the history of Mexican muralism. So I guess I was just wondering, do you see the story you're telling in your book as connected to that? I'm trying to figure out the relation between these two things because I'm not really an expert on this, but I just immediately was thinking of this sort of previous history. So thank you.
Oh, right. No, thank you as well. Let's see, from other contexts, you know, I know a certain amount about that New Deal public works period, and you know, all of the art that was produced, and you know, and certainly that you could talk about relationships between that and the history of Mexican muralism. You know, for me, the thing that is most apposite here would be the Diego Rivera mural in Detroit. That's about the Detroit auto industry. And one of the things that ticked people off in Detroit about it, at least in the auto industry, was you see a lot of workers, but you don't really see the car that they're building. You see a lot of the machinery, but you don't actually see, you know, the finished product, the beautiful gleaming car. And I think for a lot of this kind of imagery, those are some of the terms of the contradictions. So a lot of the kind of New Deal imagery was populist in the sense that you would see, say, working folks who might not have been represented. You know, there was a kind of populist emphasis on labor and laborism, at the same time as there was a real intense emphasis on progress. and especially technological progress. So in part because it was the New Deal, you're celebrating the building of massive infrastructures, in part. And sometimes these murals would be done in a kind of timeline-like way, right? So if you've seen the mural like this that's inside Coit Tower in San Francisco, Coit Tower, of course, is circular, and so you walk around them, and it's sort of like you're walking through time. You begin with primitive California Indians, and you have the Spanish-Mexican phase, then you have industrialism, and you'll see like oil rigs and tractors and machinery, and so you'll see the laborers, but there's also an aesthetic of monumental mechanical progress. So for me, some of that New Deal, like some of its limitations, is it reinforces the kinds of things that Walter Benjamin talks about. So Walter Benjamin, sort of talks about about the dangers of a kind of progressive narrative that overlooks contradiction, loss, death under capitalism, and he often sees that in these monumental, kind of monuments to industrial or capitalist progress. And so a lot of the kinds of murals that you're talking about, I'm sure there are exceptions. The way in which I think of them is that you see those progressive narratives represented by this massive technology, which often dwarfs the workers. So it's kind of a piece with the kind of aerial view I'm talking about. So this kind of aerial perspective that is large and grand and monumental, which looks down and dwarfs and minimizes actual human beings. Some of that kind of New Deal emphasis on, aren't we getting things done in terms of infrastructure? Isn't this progress? Had some of the same kind of effect.
T, go ahead.
Yeah. And I was really struck by, first of all, wonderful presentation. But I was really struck by one of the first slides you showed with the bots for helping farm workers. And I thought it was really interesting that they're not meant to take away farm workers, but indeed to like help and increase productivity for farms. But there's still this like communist aspect of it. And I was wondering if you could like explain that a little bit more, because it feels less radical than it is, if that makes sense.
Maybe say one more sentence. What's the communist part?
Yeah, I guess what I'm really asking is why is it so contested? Why is it so political if it is meant to help these workers and increase overall productivities for the farms, which would in hand be better? Like, I'm not understanding why it's seen as so subversive, and like radical.
Well, part of it, like farm workers have always been, like the UFW was always opposed to automation for fear it would, number one, get rid of jobs, and number two, de-skill and subordinate the remaining jobs, is why it was always viewed as problematic. So like on the one hand, because the dream is right, the dream of automation is, frankly, pardon my French, these are shitty jobs. These are bad jobs. These are debilitating jobs. So the idea is that, better living through machinery. We could solve human drudgery if we could just automate it. And there are a lot of issues. What actually ended up happening. Okay, so let me just give you an example. So one of the, starting in the 40s and 50s, there's a real ramping up of automation in terms of field packing. What used to happen is, there would be a lot of farm work in the field that would pack, the produce, and then you transfer it to a packing house. And the packing house was feminized labor, meaning packing was supposed to be work for women. And that meant, because it was women's labor, they could be paid less. And it was also imagined as not skilled, so they could be paid less. So one of the things that happened is they started moving these automated packing conveyor belts into the fields. And when they did that, it was as though all of that labor in the field was now like the packing house labor. It was imagined as feminized labor. So even though you were paying men to do it, you would pay them less. And it was imagined as de-skilled labor. So one of the things that Galarza argues is that automation, one of the things it did is it acted as though it swallowed up farm worker skill. So people assumed that the skilled part was being done by the machine, and the other things that farm workers did, which continued to be incredibly skilled. I mean, I dare you to do any of this stuff. Incredibly skilled labor was reimagined as non-skilled, so you could pay people less. So from the fantasy vision of agribusiness, it looked like automation was a good deal because it was going to be, more efficient. It was going to mean, you would need fewer workers doing this horrible, drudgery. But instead, what happened is you ramped up production, so you just grew a lot more. So you still needed a lot more workers, but the workers that you employed, because of the presence of the machines and automation, those workers were now newly disciplined, newly framed as unskilled, available for exploitation at a lower wage. And so that's still, so far it's been, I don't know how they talk about it in mathematics. I used to remember there were these things about two lines, going into the distance and never really meeting, or those asymptotic lines or something like that. But in California agriculture, the idea is that at some point there's going to be total automation. And that has always been this kind of receding dream where you still need to employ workers. And so one of the limits to that has to do with bougie aesthetics, meaning, one of the limits to automation is people want table grapes to look nice on the table. A machine's going to grab them and bruise them and make them look ugly. So strawberries, those kinds of things. So that's still one. So as far, until that kind of, cybernetic or automation problem gets solved, the problem of automation is that it doesn't prevent workers from being exploited. It expands the exploitation of workers. Paradoxically, right? Because we're all convinced that it means that automation means that human workers disappear. But in recent history, that's not how it's worked. I mean, maybe we're going to reach a moment.
Camila, go ahead.
So first I wanted to say this was amazing and I'm so excited to read more. My question is regarding migrant workers' circumstances now, because I live in Florida and I know it's a state with a lot of migrant workers. I have educated myself on migrant workers' experiences like in Florida, and I'm curious how you believe migrant workers are treated differently in areas such as sending states like Florida, Texas, and California versus other states. And then I also wanted to ask how I can continue to educate myself on the topic and help empower migrant workers, even though if I'm not one myself.
Great. No, that's a great question. Well, one of the things I know that I didn't know before I did this book was how important Florida was to the United Farm Workers. So Florida really was, and in part because of citrus, largely because of citrus, and because some of the same agribusiness interests, of course, in California were agribusiness interests in Florida. And so the UFW was constantly sending organizers out and what have you to Florida. And I think that there's probably more of a kind of international. There's an international story to be told about Florida and its relationship to the Caribbean in terms of agriculture that I just don't know enough that I don't know enough about. But let's see, what else was I going to say? Oh, and I guess I've been thinking, I don't know enough about, where to send you in terms of the current moment, because the big question for me that I'm trying to think about, and I just haven't, It's the pandemic, right? It's the pandemic and agricultural workers. That's the big topic. So when I was thinking about the Esther Hernandez, Sun Mad and Sun Made, I have this whole riff in the book that's about called Seeing Skeletons. That's about the visibility of skeletons and what that means, historically in a kind of Mexican cultural context and in other kinds of contexts. And I just think that's the moment we're living in. I'm not sure. I'm supposed to be writing an essay about contemporary farm workers for a handbook on Latinx studies. So maybe you should check in with me later. I'm just not really sure yet. But that's a huge, that's right. That's the issue right now, is just the disposability. We used to set, braceros, rented arms. It's now also rented lungs, right? We're all renting farm worker lungs and stuff to keep ourselves alive.
Yeah, are there any more questions? Yes, Matt, go ahead. Oh.
Sorry, I was tepidly raising my hand, but there's no way to demonstrate that on Zoom. But I did want to say that it was just a really great presentation. I guess I wanted to kind of follow up on your last, the fact that you're talking about the current COVID crisis and agricultural labor today, and also of course in the meat packing industry and things like that. One thing that I was kind of wondering throughout your whole presentation is that when we're talking about sort of the counter scripts that people are able to run within the visual field, that movement organizers or sort of social thinkers are able to promulgate, they always presuppose a public through which they can be disseminated, in which people are going to receive them. And when we think about the sort of social movements of the old left in the 30s and then the new left in the 60s and 70s, I guess I'm just wondering, when we talk about these sort of counter scripts within the visual field today, what sort of publics can we imagine them going through? I have cynical days and I have positive days, but I guess over the past few months, I've been very just disillusioned with the incredible lack of media coverage on the plight of farm workers in America during the COVID crisis. And I just wonder what is the efficacy of discussing visual sort of counterscripts when the public in which they are actually going to be shared with people seems to be so surveilled or throttled or otherwise controlled by people who would prefer people not to see those types of images. Sorry, that's a big question, and we're running out of time.
No, that's. There have just been, I don't mean to just focus on the Trump administration, because there's a longer history to these things and they're ongoing. But, the last 4 years have just been incredibly demoralizing. And there's been this kind of constant, drum beating of dehumanization. So, I was talking about that moment where the short-handled hoe was banned because, lawyer was able to convince a judge that farm workers were human beings, and I think that's a little harder even at this moment. I mean, I guess the other thing I would say though is that one of the things that I like about Rebecca Schreiber's book, and that is one of the takeaways from the film The Infiltrators, is it's that meet on the one hand. These folks who are infiltrating these ICE detention centers, they do want to get the ear of Congress people. They do want to present themselves to a broader public that might be moved by the fact that they have families or that they are students or all of those things. But at the same time, they're also quite concerned about the way in which that kind of imagery reinforces a kind of respectability politics that says you have to be a student to avoid being kidnapped by the US government, or you have to be a perfect person by some moral calculus, not to have your life upturned in this way. And so, a part of what some of this, the media circulation is about is producing different kinds of publics and reaching undocumented folks, not necessarily reaching other folks, but helping to mobilize and sustain those folks. So, a lot of the audience for this work isn't necessarily only us in relatively privileged forums like this, but are circulating in all of these kinds of very minor ways, and are for those kinds of audiences. So I can kind of see. I don't mean to be too optimistic, but I can kind of see the hopefulness of different kinds of subaltern public spheres that this kind of work would draw upon, that would engage, that would be different. But yeah, I have the days you do, where you go back and forth.
Well, Cortes, thank you very much. This was fantastic. And I have to say, a lot of members of the audience are my students in my Film and Revolution class. And they just watched South of the Earth and Alambrista. And they're also gonna read a couple of your essays for an assignment and came to the talk. So I think that some of them asked questions, but I think that this was wonderful also for our students to look at this kind of counter media that we're usually not exposed to. I was going to ask you about Star Wars because that's part of our futurism, and it's one of the things that always struck me the most. But I don't want to tire you, so thank you very much for your time and generosity and for the great talk. And it was really a pleasure to have you around.
Oh, thank you so much. And I think that's a great advertisement, Nacho. Read the chapter about Star Wars. It's surprising and fun, but thank you for noting that, and thank you so much for inviting me. It was really great and just so sustaining to be able to talk to people about ideas. So thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And thank you for the audience. We'll see you soon.
Yes.
Bye.